Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
So here we are, halfway through the 12 days, though I have not received any geese a-laying, but maybe my kids have a surprise for when I get home. So to prepare for a sermon, I like to read over the lectionary a week or two ahead of time. I find that if I let the reading sort of sit for a while, different parts will jump out and present themselves, sort of telling me what to talk about. So I found myself sitting up here during communion on Christmas Eve, turning ideas over in my head, seeing what might come to the surface. And my attention was drawn by a child. Having just received communion, she had turned around and was marching back to her seat, as only a very young child can, arms swinging, chin set in such a way that immediately conveyed how serious her job was. There was nothing that was going to stop her from getting back to her seat. She was fully committed to the task. Now, this got me thinking about the way my own girls acted and still act when it comes to being serious and committing to something. Kids seem to have this natural ability to give themselves over fully to ideas and activities in a way that most adults find exceedingly hard, if not impossible. It's easy to think of the things kids believe in while young they stop believing in as they age. Literally every Christmas movie centers around this idea, but it's not limited to holiday-related beings. Just the other day, I watched my oldest daughter sit for hours building Legos, as focused on those plastic bricks as if she was revising Pennsylvania's bridge infrastructure. It was the most important thing for her. She was fully committed to it. Now, I think back to my own childhood and how strong my grandfather seemed. I remember seeing him lift things that had me believing he could move the house by himself if it needed to be moved. And there was nothing that was going to convince me otherwise. But most of us are not like that anymore. Something happens. Something changes. We end up growing bigger than our grandfathers. We don't find the tasks in front of us as important anymore. And it's harder to have unquestioning faith in ideas and things we cannot see. We are older, wiser, smarter. We become rational. We ask questions and demand answers. We lose our tolerance for ambiguity or gray areas. Our worlds shrink to only what is within our reach. In many ways, this is a beneficial change because we're able to evaluate different tasks based on relative importance. Our hobbies can still be important, but they sit second chair to things like work. Unlike children, we know that brushing our teeth is more important than finishing a Lego set. We understand the difference between things we must do and things we can do or want to do. Now, of course, like everything else humans do, we take this too far. We get burned out with work. We lose the enjoyment that we had in our hobbies. And we can lose perspective on what is important, like our jobs, and what is also important, like our families. Now, I think this is why the earnestness with which that little girl walked back to her seat struck me so. She embodied the seriousness of her task with her whole being. The adults around her, including myself, did not. For my part, I was sitting here, not reflecting on some aspect of the Christmas Eve service, the Nativity, or Father Aidan's sermon. No, I had moved on and was daydreaming about something I had to do in a week's time. Now, this all occurred to me, and I felt very convicted. I felt like I had been rebuked. And it was Paul's words to the Galatians that gave me solace. He says, "Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed." Paul is addressing a church that is still emerging from its Jewish roots and struggling with leaving many of the requirements of the law behind. Now, I find it interesting that in the Greek, Paul does not say that we were imprisoned and guarded under the law. The word he uses is garrisoned under the law. Now, I think the English translation does a good job of expressing both the safety found in the law and also the non-voluntary nature of its imposition. But in our context, I think it's all too easy to see only the imprisoned side of things, to see our ancestors as trapped under the law of Moses, to be set free once Christ comes. Now, our modern sensibilities, they love this. Our love of liberty, individuality, reject the idea of being imprisoned. And even Paul refers to the people as slaves under the law. However, we need to see the deeper understanding. The side where the people were guarded under the law, where we were garrisoned and protected by the law until Christ came. There is a large section of Paul's letter to the Galatians that is left out of today's reading, from chapter 3, verse 26 to chapter 4, verse 3. And Paul makes the case that a child, an heir to a household, is no better off than a slave while they're a minor. He says, "My point is this: heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, though they are the owners of all the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So they have an inheritance, but one which they cannot touch until their father deems they are old enough." It reminds me of the story of the prodigal son, demanding his inheritance before he was really ready. And we know how it ended. He came back asking to be made a slave. The argument Paul is making is not that we have been set free from some unjust bondage under the law, but that we were children, protected and guided by the law until we were ready for our inheritance. Now, I shudder to think what choices my kids would make if they were free to ignore the rules that my wife and I set for them. I actually get a taste of this anytime we stay with a grandparent for the weekend. Children, for all their ability to give themselves wholly to a task, are not ready to set their own rules. They need parental limits as surely as humans needed the limits of the law. It is through the coming of Jesus that we are freed from the need for the discipline of the law provided. It is through faith in our baptism that we are made children of God. As Paul puts it, "So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then also an heir through God." There is a great Hebrew word that embodies the concept of inheritance in a way that I do not think our English terms do. The word is nahalah. It's actually kind of fun to say if you want to try it. Nahalah. It means inheritance, but in a very broad way. It does mean the physical inheritance, lands, a house, money, but it also means the honor of your father, the family's good name. It goes even further to cover the idea of lineage and descendants. So nahalah means not only the goods you receive as your inheritance, but the responsibilities that become yours. What you owe to both the past generation and to the future ones. Now, this is what Paul knew his audience would think of when he said we become heirs to God. Not just what we would gain as heirs, but what we would become responsible for. Now, we too bear this role of heir and all that comes with it. And that begs the question, are we fulfilling our roles? Are we living as we should at all times? Are we safeguarding the honor and good name which has been given to us? Or are we sitting and daydreaming during Christmas Eve communion? Are we hopping from task to task and event to event, always looking at what comes next, keeping busy by wasting time? Paul knew the dangers we would face. They haven't changed from what the Galatians faced. His warning is also left out of today's reading, but I think it bears hearing. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to beings that by nature are not God's. Now, however, that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits? The Galatians were slipping back to their pre-Christian beliefs and adopting Jewish traditions making themselves slaves to the law. Now, I don't expect any of us are in danger of erecting an altar to Baal or Thor in our yards, but I do think we're all in danger of making shrines to far more subtle gods. Many of us are probably carrying a portable shrine to the god of work right now. On Christmas Eve, I built a shrine in my head to the god of what's next. Now, children are not ready to make their own rules, so they need a disciplinarian to set boundaries for them. In growing up and gaining the ability to set our own limits, we trade away the ability to commit ourselves fully to multiple things. We push aside what is going on right in front of us for something that is more important. We take that work call during a birthday party. We skip church because we have tickets to the game. Or we daydream during service because we have a sermon to write for next Sunday. Now, I'm not saying we all need to quit our jobs, sever our family ties, and run off into the woods to be monastic hermits. The kingdom needs teachers and doctors and parents as much as it needs hermits. But what I am saying is that we need to be aware of the way we act and think. Are we doing the things we're supposed to be doing? Are we giving our whole selves to those things? We need to be careful and mindful of what we are supposed to do. We are not guarded and garrisoned by the law any longer. We need to rely on our faith and seek our direction from Christ. Once we have discerned our path, we need to make sure we are not just phoning it in. We need to give our whole selves to the work. We need to live up to that nahalah, the inheritance that God has given us. We are called to do as Isaiah proclaims, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My whole being shall exalt in my God. For he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with robes of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with a garland, and a bride adorns herself with jewels. We should take hold of the responsibilities we inherit as children of God, clothe ourselves with them, and rejoice with our whole being. Amen.